So in this scene, because I've taken a few days off to recover from having a bit of a cold, I decided to essentially just group a bunch of the prompts together. So this is actually 4 prompts in one. I'm doing hexagons for 6-sided, so you'll see hexagonal tiles on the floor. For round, I have a spiral staircase, which you'll see, and for red and green, we have flowers and all of the foliage. So the process is actually fairly simple. People always get put off by these really big trees, but it's actually quite a basic way of setting things up here. I'm just building a few assets, fairly simple workflow, just, lines, doing the curve to mesh to get the thickness. Stuff like getting the round edge table, I'm using the torus from my toolkit and then just a convex hole, so that gives me a nice round edge circle. For the shelves and things, it's just a little bit of manipulating boxes and grids and things like that. So it's all a very simple process. Things did get a little bit more complicated when I was making the slightly more decorative ironwork for the larger table, but again, this is just using spirals and lines and then skinning them in a fairly straightforward manner. Now for the shelves and the small and large tables, I also made sure to capture an attribute that would work as a selection essentially for my point distribute, so that I was able to specifically put points on the top surfaces. And this is basically what I used for getting the pots to be in, viable positions. I'll get more into those in a minute, but you can see that I've made the staircase. So that's just, again, pretty simple, just taking a grid, squeezing down one end to give me the taper, putting all of these onto a spiral, and I just basically made my section bigger and bigger so that it would accumulate more parts. So it has the framework, and then there's kind of an imitation ironwork. I wanted to make something that would give the sense that it was quite delicate floral pattern, something like that. So all I did was I just kind of screwed up a Bezier and then cropped it to the mesh by using the raycast and delete any geometry that was outside. That actually worked quite well in this case. And then just instancing it on a spiral to make it into a spiral staircase. Nice and easy. And there's a bunch more assets, things like fruit crates and watering cans. So the watering cans and the spiral staircase both ended up being a little bit of a time sink. Not in really a bad way or anything, just that there was a lot of detail that doesn't really come out when even when you're walking around the scene. You have to get really close up to the spiral staircase to really get a sense of the ironwork on it. Equally for the table with its curly ironwork underneath, and the watering can with its curly handle parts. It's all just one of those things where it's very easy to get a little bit tunnel visioned and get too close to what you're making that you don't really notice that you're, I don't want to say wasting time, but you're spending your time perhaps in a less intelligent way than you might be. Still a fun process though, and in the nature of Nodevember, it's good exercise to try and see what kinds of things you can do, try out different processes, see what is available, so that in the future projects you have these tools at your disposal. Now of course, especially with a scene like this where you have a huge number of objects, I would definitely recommend that you manually make more of them than I did. I mean, going to this extent to make stuff using nodes, just 100% nodes, is not really a sensible way of working. It is possible to do stuff and to make it look good, but it's such a lot of additional work to get what really should be only a couple of minutes of effort using traditional techniques. And if you know what you're aiming for, you don't really need the freedom that proceduralism gives you. You should just be able to make the thing, Another thing I really wanted to try in this scene was actually using geometry nodes for instancing lights, and that would give me a lot of control for things like positioning, rotation. Obviously, because I'm using cycles here to render everything, I'm able to use things like the random per object value in the shader for the light to give me random brightness or random color, whatever you want really for the spotlights. It's quite a good process. You do have to be aware with geometry nodes that if you realize instances after you have a lamp, or if you put something like a set material after a lamp, you're going to actually lose all of your lamp instances. So it is just important to be careful that you maintain their instance-ness as you work on them. So I was just kind of making sure that I built my meshes for my lights. So I did a simple track light, which is just essentially a rail which has a bunch of spotlights underneath it. And then I could make the lights and I could instance those, and I could instance the spotlights as part of that light. And as long as there's nothing afterwards, then you're good to go. As long as you're just joining those things towards the end of the tree, nothing should break apart. but it just gave me a lot of flexibility. And towards the end of the scene, I actually had a problem where the scene actually got so dark because of all of the plants in there kind of absorbing the light and reflecting the light around, that I needed to add just a lot more lighting. But because I had it all procedurally generated and it was working to a system, I could just double the number. You know, I just went from having, I think I was 6 up, and then I went up to 10, and that basically just saved me a whole load of effort. It was a really nice way of working. So there's a bunch of other stuff that I've been adding. There's the brick walls along the back and the hexagons on the floor. So 6-sided, that brief is for the hexagon floor. And I did make some variations to them with some noise, and I made a few different tiles. But essentially, that's pretty much just following the hex grid node from my toolkit. So that's really easy. And the brick wall along the 3 sides, actually, that's just the brick wall node from my toolkit. So nice and easy, and a very simple shader just to give a little bit of random color per object. Now I can't really prevent myself from doing a little bit of interior design, so I did add a slat wall down towards the till and give it a bit of a counter with similar material. And I also add a little bit of an acoustic buffer above that one later on. Now this is actually where it gets a little bit more interesting, right? So instancing and positioning objects in the scene. This is where you really get the power of geometry nodes. Making the individual things is cool, but for general things, right? For making specific tables, specific shelves, specific milk crates, stuff like that, proceduralism isn't going to help you much compared to traditional modeling techniques. Whereas actually the positioning, this is where you're going to get the most out of geometry nodes. And this is actually why I keep my node tree like one level. I use node groups specifically for tools, like self-contained tools that do a specific thing to data, where you want it as one node. But when I'm building something, I want to have access to all of the data that's in there all of the time, because it means that I can pull off specific bits of the mesh. Or later on when I'm doing the hanging vines and things like that, I can pull things like the window surrounds and the acoustic baffle above the till and the till itself and the back wall. I can grab all of these specific bits of geometry without needing to modify groups. So it's much more convenient working on a large tree like this. Although I absolutely recommend that you get the Node Minimap add-on, because that is just a lifesaver for big trees, as well as the Noodler add-on, which I will link both of those in the description below. So Noodler basically saved me a lot because I was putting everything in frames, which I would name. But Noodler allows you to do really long distance connections very easily by essentially you select one node, go to the way you want to connect it, and then you just hit V and then shift and hover over the node that you're connecting to, and it will connect up. And it also allows you to search. So I was able to search specific frame names that I knew that I was wanting to jump to, for example, the counter or the stairs, something like that. And I could literally just jump to them really, really quickly. So for the instancing itself, you start with the big stuff, right? So I hand position a bunch of stuff like the walls, and then it's like, okay, well, I have this floor area, and I know that I want to put the tables in here, but I know that I want them to avoid the spiral staircase. So you just take something like a geometry proximity, and you use that to control the distribution of points on your floor area. Then you can instance your large tables. And then you think, well, I want to instance my small tables, and I want them to be around the large tables, but not underneath, really. They want to be close to the large tables, but just around them, you know. So then you do the same thing again. You take your floor area, you instance a bunch of points on it, and then you can use the geometry proximity to essentially find a band. I used it with the float compare set to equals. So it was a band where the distance was a specific value. So maybe like 1 meter out from the table with a thickness of 0.5 meters. And that would basically mean that I would have this band around each table where I could instance the smaller tables. And then you're going to think like, well, okay, now I have the large tables and the small tables. I put the big shelves along the back wall. So now I want to put in my fruit crates, and the fruit crates want to go on top of the tables and on the floor underneath the tables. So then suddenly you have the floor and the tabletops. Use these for your instancing. Use the geometry proximity on the floor to make sure that you're instancing in a specific region that you want to do, like where it's very close to the tables, to the large tables, but while still avoiding the small tables. And essentially it's just a process of this building up and building up and building up. And you have just processes in your head anyway. You know the rules. I don't want this to intersect with this, but I want it to be near to that. It's a very simple way of building things up, and it's actually very repetitive. There's not really a huge amount of diversity in the workflow. It's just pick a few things, instance points, drop your thing on, and then you potentially use that again later with geometry proximity to either avoid or attract other things. So it's quite a nice but easy process. Now, I also added a few little decoration things, like the ceiling. I added some ventilation shafts, which was just very simple, just curved mesh, and give it like a little profile and give it some tilt along the length of the curve, and that gave me a little twist, so it looks like those kind of steel tubes with the seam running down them. I also added some cable trays, which were again very simple, just a grid which I pulled up the sides of, and then did a wireframe, essentially like mesh to curve, curve to mesh. And then I also put in some lines just running down them with a little bit of variation in the X and Y, just to make them look like they had cables in, basically. I recommend, if you're doing this stuff, that you do work through with your set material nodes. As soon as you end up with a few thousand nodes like this, it does get pretty heavy. So you just want to make sure that you're doing things as you go to make your life as easy as possible. Now, for the windows themselves, I basically just boxed out some general surrounds. It was a very simple process, just literally moving and transforming boxes. And then for the windows, I added like a grid and then curved it slightly just along its length. So again, just index manipulation and a little bit of maths. And then that again was just mesh to curve, curve to mesh to give me the nice framework, because I wanted that sort of crittle look. So crittle for the windows, and then you've got the ironwork on the tables and the staircase, and it all just sort of ties in a little bit together. So then it's all about the pots. Well, I wanted to bring all of these pots in, instance them around in their location, so on the floor, on the tables, and on the till. Also, I wanted to have some coming up the stairs. And then at this point, I started working on shaders, really. I just started putting some shaders on stuff, some basic shaders, just to make sure that things were starting to get coloured. I didn't want to have this massive marathon at the end where I was trying to get shaders basically everywhere. I knew that was going to be a bit more of a chore than I was down for, so I wanted to make sure I was splitting it up and working as I went. A lot of stuff is very, very simple, just random colours and a little bit of noise for roughness and things like that. But I did also add some like watermarks to the floor, just sort of tweaked them around. And I knew that the floor was a little bit lumpy anyway, because I'd already messed up the displacement in geometry nodes, but I wanted to make sure that the water was somewhat flat, so I did a little bit of normal control with that, using some normal vectors. Because I'm actually using the same material on the wall and the floor that you do see if you do look around the scene, the file is linked down below, that you'll find that there's some patches on the wall where you have these vertical streaks, and that is actually just the puddles have been stretched up the walls, which is not really ideal, but it's one of those things that you can kind of get away with, especially with a little personal project like this. Now, there's a lot more things that I wanted to add, because it's just, as soon as you're working in an interior space, especially something like a plant shop, like a florist, it can get very heavy very, very quickly. And I wanted to take advantage of the instancing, and I wanted to take advantage of the proceduralism, basically allowing me to push the scale of what I could make and the kind of, the number of the things that I could make. So I had to work out the best way to do it, really. That I used this as an excuse to come up with a new way of making foliage, because I've been very much in the process of making trees in the same way that everybody makes trees. You make a mesh line or a curve line, and then you use like a curve to mesh with a profile, and that gives you your trunk, right? And you can do some displacement on that, or you can put on a shader. You've got your trunk, nice and easy. Then you just want to instance some more curves on it, skin those up to make them thick, and then you have your branches, and then you can instance your leaves on it. It's all just the same process. Everybody does it. Everybody just makes trees in this very standard way, which is fine because it works. But it's also, I wanted something that was a little bit more flexible, because doing it in that way means that you need to make, for example, 4 specific trees and then instance those 4 specific trees. I wanted a way that I could say, here is 1,000 points, generate me 1,000 trees, and I want them to be unique. Now, this is a little bit more heavy because we're still using instancing, but we're making a lot more granular instances, rather than it being like, here's a few instances and then we're going to instance those things as individual blocks. It got a lot heavier for sure, but I was able to come up with a kind of way to do it. You have to just do this from the start though. That's what I came to the conclusion of. It's very difficult to reverse engineer this. If you make a tree generator or a plant generator that generates a specific tree or plant, then that's what it's going to do. But if you build a generator which can generate 100 plants, then you'll still be able to get that one. It might not be specifically the one that you ask for, but it will be one, and you can just, go through the seeds until you find one you like. But it also means, as long as you have that forward planning, it means that you're going to be able to get 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 different plants, and they're going to be unique. And it's really just down to whether or not your computer can actually process that size of data. Now, some of these didn't really lend themselves to it so well. The cactuses really, really did, because they were so simple. And I did also add a couple of pot plants, which did. Some of them were certainly less easy. Although, now I'm thinking about it now, just doing this commentary, I actually think I could have done it with the foresight that I now have to be able to go and build these systems up in a much more complex way from the beginning. It's all about just having the awareness and the foresight to be able to plan ahead, I guess. But that's what's so good about these exercises, is you can go to those things now. I know how this can work. I've had the chance to explore those things. And one thing I would say is, because a lot of these things like the branches and the tree trunks, these are using the curve to mesh. And if you're using curve to mesh, then you have to generate your own UV maps manually. It's a little bit of a trial, but you can just do it, using the curve parameter and capture attributes. Now, when you do this, you need to make sure that if you instance your trees or whatever, you realize them afterwards, because otherwise you're not actually going to be able to pass out that attribute. And also, if you have lots of things which use the same attribute as I do here, like a lot of basically everywhere that I wanted to manually generate a UV map, I use the same attribute. You just add them together, right? You just use vector math add. I recommend when you're working, this is again part of the strength of using the materials nice and early, is you just keep either your UV attribute that you've made yourself, or if you're using the default one, you need an attribute node with UV_map, all lowercase, and that is going to allow you to use the default UV maps if you're using something like a plane or a cylinder. So all of my leaf materials I just set to the UV map attribute immediately, and for the branches and trunks and things like that, I just set that to my custom UV map. And this basically meant that as I was working in cycles view, which I had to do for the last half of the process, because solid and EV actually cannot handle this size of scene, so I was stuck with cycles, but it was actually kind of fine on my hardware, so that was okay. But working with the attributes permanently on show meant that I could see like, oh, I've broken something there because everything's now gone black, or it's working all right and everything still shows me the UV map. And it just worked as a constant check for me. So I was able to make sure that as I was working through, all of my leaves were going to end up with UV maps and all of my branches were going to end up with UV maps that I could use later when it came to do the shaders. Nothing is worse than getting to the end of a project and being like, whoa, I have to go and find that data in these 4,000 nodes. Well, that's just not going to be a good time for you. So try and make sure that you have something in place to just make your life a little bit easier as you work through. Make sure that you are safeguarding yourself against needing to undo errors a long time after you've actually made them. All right, there's actually quite a lot of plants going on. So we had some ferns, didn't do a good job of those. And they were made with the meshes, and we had a few of the earlier trees that I was again using the meshes. So meshes are convenient because they have the default UVs. However, the curves are super flexible. So I started coming into this different workflow where I was actually using curves in the curve parameter node. So I could push the curve parameter through a float curve and then use that in the radius. And then when I did my curve to mesh, I was able to use my my radius to control the size and shape of my leaves. So it was a really good process and definitely sped things up a little bit. I found it a lot easier to work with than using using meshes, because the curve parameter is always 0 to 1, right? You can have 1,000 points in your curve and it's 0 to 1. But if you're doing it with meshes, you have to be a little bit more aware of your indices and just like controlling indices, and that can get into a little bit of trouble as well. So definitely easier using the curves. I don't know how scalable it is when it comes to doing the like make 1 versus make 10,000 objects, but I think it's probably the best way to go. And you do have the combination of processes because you do end up with a mesh at the end of it, so you can still use texture displacement. Now with the roses themselves, I did make a petal and then I instanced it around the phyllotaxis node, which is from the toolkit, but I had to make sure that rather than each petal being a unique object, because that would mess up my shader, which is different per flower, I needed to make sure that I was realizing those instances for the petals and then instancing the actual flower heads themselves. And that basically made sure that each flower was its own block rather than each petal being its own block. So if you do want to grab this file, it is available from Patreon. It's free and it's public, so you can go ahead and grab that from the link in the description. There's a lot of bad stuff in here. I mean, like, there's a lot of processes which didn't really work, but I used them because I had them, like making all of the ivy and stuff. But then there's also quite a lot of fun stuff, like how I made the hanging ivy that came out of the baskets. So that's using like a raycast to check whether or not there's anything underneath, and if there is not, then it will just drop the ivy. So that worked quite nicely. Some of the plants are super simple, like the pot plants, which just use the curve parameters just to make their leaves and everything. Or there's the spider plants, which are using the copy on points node, which is a big one, but at the same time very useful if you want to transfer all of your attributes directly to instances. And then generating the cactuses was just like a really easy but actually quite a good process for being able to generate like X number of objects. However many you want, you can have. If you want to make 20 million cactuses, be my guest. Now in the end, I did think that I was going to be manually instancing a bunch of stuff like the trees, so I was going to manually position for a little bit of composition, but I thought, at this point it's kind of such a clutter in this space. I don't want to go and hand position stuff because I don't really know what I'm going for. So rather than mess it up myself, I'd rather just mess it up with geometry nodes. That kind of gives me the freedom to do that. That was quite a nice process. And I had a lot of table space free, so I went onto Pinterest and just had a look at what flower shops do, and they just put pots everywhere. So I made some nice little pots here, like little cans. They might be like candles or something like that. Very simple, just a cylinder with a cone at the top to make the sort of lid chamfer. And then I also instanced another cylinder around it. So I had the steel for the main cone, and then I procedurally generated this label with the shaders just for the middle section of the cylinder. And again, just using that cylinder allowed me to use the default UV map, which is all lowercase UV_map in the attribute node in the shader. So if you do want to use this, grab it from the link down below. You will find that the file opens with Suzanne visible. I recommend that you go into Cycles viewport first, and then you enable the modifier, just because you'll probably find that if you're doing it on Eevee or Solid View, either Blender will crash or it will just become unresponsive for a few minutes. So patience is a virtue, but you will get there eventually. You may find as well that the nodes are actually not really fast. Like just drawing the nodes is quite heavy. There's 4,127 nodes in this one node tree. I know it's a bit excessive, but it was also a lot of fun to put it together. So I just I let it be. Would I definitely do something a little bit different in the future with, multiple node trees or multiple objects? Maybe, probably. I definitely would do more stuff manually, but personally for me, I really like the workflow of doing everything within a single tree because it gives you so much more freedom for actually generating stuff and having access to all of the bits that you need whenever you want them. So personal preference, but I personally like the big node tree. Hopefully this has been fun. Hopefully you've enjoyed seeing the process. It was about 15 hours all in, which I did across 2 days. So I did it on the 11th and the 13th just to occupy myself. So there we go. Hope you've had fun, and I will see you in the next one.